phases of the school's development. And then finally, clear evidence of the applicant's capacity. So I hope you will keep some of those aspects in mind as I present the recommendations of the review committee and our findings after reviewing these applications. Those were certainly criteria that were very much top of mind for us and things that are reflected in the rubric that we are required to use as a review committee from the Department of Education. A few more notes on quality practices for authorizers. Authorizers should only grant charters to applicants that have demonstrated competence and capacity to succeed in all aspects of their particular school model. Rigorously evaluate each application, and the standard goes on to specify that a rigorous evaluation includes an individual review of each application, a capacity interview with applicants, which we were able to do, and we appreciated the opportunity to be able to meet our applicants and touch base with them in person and ask them some questions. And then finally, independent due diligence that review committee members may do. For an example, if we were to have an applicant who was an existing operator in other states that was coming to Tennessee for the first time, review committee members might spend time researching the performance of some of those existing schools. That wasn't the case with the applicants that we had this year, but that's just an example of what independent due diligence might look like. Engage a highly competent team of internal and external evaluators with relevant educational, organizational, governance and management, financial, and legal expertise, as well as a thorough understanding of the essential principles of charter school autonomy and accountability. On January 11th, Dr. Huff prepared and presented to you all a recommendation for who would sit on the review committee for this review of charter applications. That review committee consisted of 20 members for your consideration at that point in time, and you ultimately approved that group. It included CMCSS cabinet members, members of the academic team and the instruction team of CMCSS, and also some external members who were able to bring some governance expertise in nonprofit management, and things of that nature. So we really worked to ensure that we had a diverse range of perspectives included on that review committee, and ultimately it was a much better review process as a result of all of the expertise that was brought to that. I do want to mention, we started with 20 members of that review committee that you all approved. One of our review committee members did roll off the committee in between February and March. He had some external commitments that were making it difficult for him to attend our meetings, and so he did roll off the review committee, and ultimately we ended with 19 review committee members. As far as the application review process and what that looked like, I wanted to give you an overview of what this process shook out like and what some of the different dates were. So as I indicated, on January 11th, you all approved the Charter Review Committee. We had received letters of intent from 2 possible charter applicants, so we worked to ensure that review committee could be established so that when those applications were received before or on the February 1st deadline, we wanted to be sure we could immediately set to work to review those applications and give them consideration. In the month of February, the review team undertook what's called the initial review. In a charter application review process, review committee members complete an initial review, they conduct a capacity interview with candidates, and then they complete a final review of that application. And so in the month of February, on the 4th, the 11th, and the 24th, review committee members met and we reviewed the application, various pieces of it in groups as well as individually. Members of the review committee that had expertise in specific areas, whether it was related to governance or facilities management or any of those areas, had a chance to share some of their expertise and insights so that all review committee members could approach the application with a sound understanding of the kinds of things they needed to look for as they engaged in that initial review. In between, and one thing I want to mention too, the charter notebooks that we had that were our applications, the full applications, those were also shared in the month of February. So you all had those notebooks that you could use to review. Between February 24th and March 18th, review committee members conducted their initial review. And then on March 18th, we met and finalized the initial review process and prepared for our capacity interviews that took place on March 25th. And then finally, between our capacity interviews and Friday, April 1st, review committee members engaged in the final review process, took the information that we learned from the capacity interviews, and we first to establish our final review and ultimately determine our recommendation that we would make to you all tonight. And the last bullet on there is Tuesday, April 12th, which is today. We are getting your recommendation. A few more quick notes about the application review process. State law requires that districts who receive charter applications review those applications, make a recommendation for board vote, and ultimately that a board will vote on whether to approve or deny those applications within 90 days. So we had a really tight window in which to work once we received those applications to ensure that we were able to give a thorough review, but also meet the requirements of state law to complete that review within 90 days. Review members conducted individual reviews. Ultimately, I am presenting you tonight with our group consensus. So the recommendations that you're hearing tonight are the recommendations of the review committee as a whole. I've linked here the Department of Education rubric. As I indicated, the Tennessee Department of Education has a rubric established that districts are to use when they receive charter applications, and that's outlined in state law as well, that we are to use that rubric. There are several different sections of that rubric. The applications are long and the rubric itself is quite extensive as well. But overall, there are 3 different summary sections of a charter application rubric that we will provide you with overall scores for. The scores that you can establish, that you can give on a charter application rubric, are either meets or exceeds the standard, partially meets the standard, or does not meet the standard. According to the law, all summary ratings must be at meets or exceeds the standard for an application to be approved. So I wanted to be sure I shared that with you as I go through these summary ratings, what that expectation is. As I indicated, each charter application rubric has 3 different sections that are called summary sections. There is a section for academics, there's a section for operations, and then there's a section for finances and financial management. The first section about academics, I've provided to you all of the different subsections that you'll see there that are encompassed in that. I'm not going to go through that entire bulleted list, but the academic operations of the school calendar, disciplinary practices, school mission and vision, all of those different aspects are included within the section 1 component of a charter application. I'm going to present you with the summary ratings for one of our applicants. I'll start with American Classical Academy Montgomery. I'll walk through each of the summary ratings for you, as well as the strengths and weaknesses or deficiencies that were identified by the review committee. And then I will go through our Oxton Academy Charter High School applicant next. All right, so I just wanted to be sure you had a sense of where I was going. So as I indicated, I'll begin with American Classical Academy Montgomery and the summary scores for that particular applicant. On section 1, academic plan, design, and capacity, the review committee felt this applicant partially meets the standard. There are several strengths that we identified. One, there is a focus on a small school environment, which we appreciated. There's also a focus on individual programming and individualized support, which the review committee appreciated seeing as well. Another thing that we identified as a strength, the organization has spent some time working at the state level to build some state connections and work with partners at that level to ensure they understand the requirements of state law and that they understand state standards. One concern in the initial review of this application was that several of the curricular materials that the applicant indicated they plan to use in their application, they specified they were aligned with Common Core state standards, which is not allowable in Tennessee. Curricular materials are expected to be aligned to the Tennessee academic standards. And so that was something they were able to clarify for us in their interview, that they were working with state partners on and would ensure that they had materials that aligned with the standards. There were several, they were also able to answer several material questions about some of their academic approaches that were initially concerning to the review committee and were ultimately alleviated in their interview. For instance, some of their approaches to response to instruction and intervention, or RTI squared, as it's also called, and their approaches to interventions with students were not necessarily aligned with Tennessee guidelines, but they were able to clarify some of their approaches in their interview and how they were going to obtain some flexibility around those guidelines that ultimately alleviated that concern of the review committee. The deficiencies of the review that the review committee highlighted, first and foremost, the review committee has concerns about the applicant's approach to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. There were verbiage concerns in the application that were not fully addressed in the interview. Specifically, there was a portion of their student manual where they indicated they would require students to be independently toileting, and that was very concerning to the review committee because that's not in alignment with IDEA. Overall, there's also just not a level of experience or expertise that the review committee could detect in their current leadership team or in their board, specifically for working with students with disabilities. The review committee couldn't detect a level of expertise there that was concerning. And ultimately, that lack of expertise, especially in light of some of the verbiage issues noted, was a major concern to the review committee. Second, the applicant did not elicit community support for their model on the front end of the application process. According to state law, applicants for a charter school must demonstrate community support. And upon submitting their application, there were no letters of support from members of the Clarksville-Montgomery County community included in their initial application. Letters were included from the citizens of Nashville, from some citizens of Rutherford County, and from some citizens of Franklin, Tennessee, but there were none from Clarksville-Montgomery County community members. Upon the capacity interview, we noted that with the applicant, and they indicated they had been collecting some additional letters of support, which they were willing to share with us at that point in time. And we accepted those letters so that we could review them and get a sense of what kind of support they had been continuing to build as they had been working in the community. They did provide those letters of support, as I indicated, but the timing and depth of those letters of support was not sufficient to demonstrate community support. Upon reviewing the letters provided, the majority of them appeared to be dated on March 25th, which was the day of their interview, rather than collecting them along the way, as they indicated. And in some instances, letters were time-stamped after their interview, which the review committee found unusual. Similarly, upon reading many of the letters, we found that there were many duplicate letters. Around 5 out of 12 were either identical or nearly identical, which the review committee could not rightly say indicated a broad indication of support. Similarly, some of the information in the applicant's materials indicate that there are maybe some areas where they lack awareness of our community and its needs. For instance, their application did not include information for how they would support military families specifically, and they also referenced that our district has several magnet schools, which is not accurate. Finally, the applicant does not indicate there is an existing school in the community that provides a version of a classical education. It may not be the exact model that this applicant seeks to provide, but there is a school in Clarksville-Montgomery County that does provide a classical model. And we would have liked to see this applicant better distinguish themselves from that existing model to know if it's a unique opportunity for families in this community. Another area that the review committee highlighted as a deficiency is that the applicant did not provide compelling data to show the effectiveness of their model, nor did the applicant provide compelling evidence that they would be successful in closing the achievement gap. The applicant did share some research about their curricular choices in their application, especially the core knowledge curriculum, which is one that they highlight they plan to depend on heavily. However, the review committee had two concerns about this research. One, the articles cited were from 2003 and 2004. And both statewide and nationally, we are operating under completely different academic standards, and that rendered these comparisons unhelpful. Two, while these studies may point to some effectiveness of the core knowledge curriculum that the applicant plans to use, the classical model itself was not a subject of the study that the review committee could detect. There are traditional public school districts that use the core knowledge curriculum and may or may not have a classical model in place. So as far as the actual instructional model, the review committee couldn't accurately determine whether that was the source of success. Further, information provided by the applicant about the performance of some of their existing schools, because though this applicant, American Classical Education, is new to Tennessee, they are part of a network of some other existing charter schools that are operating in other states. And they often pointed in their application to the success of some of those other schools in their network. They cited that schools in their network received an A or B score compared with traditional public school counterparts. But because every state has the flexibility to adopt their own accountability system, seeing that A or B rating without knowing what those accountability systems actually look like doesn't give us a whole lot of evidence that the classical model is effective. Similarly, Similarly, the applicant included some academic data in attachment H of their application that provided insight about the performance of some of their schools. However, it's only data that shows average proficiency of students by grade band compared with their peers in the district and the state. The data were not broken down by subgroups, which provides no insight about whether the applicant's model would be successful in closing achievement gaps, and that is an explicit area highlighted in the application. Similarly, without growth data, the review committee felt that we could not make that determination. Finally, and this was an important area for the review committee, one of the challenges in reviewing charter school applications is that often they may be presenting untested, innovative teaching methods that don't have a level of research necessarily, because it's an attempt to create an innovation lab where we can try different strategies and see what kinds of things may work better to serve students. However, in this case, this applicant continually emphasized that their model is time-tested and that they will benefit from being part of a network of existing successful schools. But ultimately, the application did not provide substantive evidence to undergird those claims. The second section of our charter applications are the operations plan and capacity sections. Again, I won't go through each of these bullets individually, but this area covers governance of charter school applicants, startup plans, facilities, human capital, and all of those different areas. Also, transportation and food services are included in this section. Ultimately, the review committee felt that the applicant did not meet the standard for this portion of the application. Again, several strengths. The applicant clearly presented a plan A and a plan B for their facilities, and has admirable visions for their educational facilities and what they hope to provide to students if they have an opportunity to build a school. Initially, upon initial review, their contingency plan for a facility was not sufficient, and the review committee had concerns going into the interview about that. However, they provided some sound reasoning for why that existed in the course of their interview that allowed the review committee to see what their goals were ultimately with a facility. The applicant also acknowledged the challenges of the real estate market in this community. As you all know, we have one of the hottest, for lack of a better term, real estate communities right now. We have a market that is really competitive, and so hearing the applicant have a greater understanding of those challenges that they may face was reassuring to the review committee and helped alleviate some of the initial concerns that we had about their preparation. Another strength, the review committee felt that the insurance coverage assurance that was provided by the applicant, there are requirements for the kind of insurance that applicants have to demonstrate that they will have, and we felt that insurance coverage was competitive. And then finally, the applicant provided some assurance to the review team with regard to their teacher recruitment strategies, that they had a slightly better approach than what it appeared when we first reviewed the application. Initially, upon review, the applicant indicated they plan to pull primarily from their network of their college that they're affiliated with, Hillsdale College, and the teacher prep candidates that would be graduating from that program. Given that it's such a small university, and you all are well aware, our district has spoken many times about the teacher shortage challenges that our state is experiencing, and many states are experiencing nationwide, the review committee was concerned that that was their primary strategy for recruitment, and we worried that that would not allow them to have a robust pool of candidates. However, they were able to explain that they had more of a layered approach to that process, and they would use some other strategies first, and that was assuring to the review committee. The deficiencies in the application, the review committee had concerns with the proposed governance structure that the organization has. And in particular, there were concerns that the remote nature of this board could make it challenging for them to meet open meetings law requirements and conduct business in a transparent manner. To their credit, the organization appears to be adding more local members to their board, at least local to Tennessee. They indicated in their interview that they are adding a couple of additional members to their board that are local to Tennessee. But ultimately, the review committee felt that the information in the application and what they provided in their interview was not sufficient to alleviate our earlier concerns. One of the major things that we noticed was the grievance process that the applicant indicates they plan to use, where grievances will be addressed to the board. Currently, the board that's established appears to have a statewide focus, governing all of the schools that may be approved in the state of Tennessee. And so some of the questions that we were left with was, will the statewide board hear concerns of parents in our local school? Will there be some kind of a local advisory committee established? The applicant does mention that in their organization, but that committee has not been formed up to this point. And how will that organization play a role in hearing concerns? Furthermore, the applicant references public participation policies that will govern participation in their meetings, but the applicant did not include board policies in their application as directed. That is supposed to be attachment F7 in a charter application, and the applicant indicated that they were still working on their board policies with their general counsel. Understandable, but we weren't able to assess without the board policies being in the application, and ultimately that section was incomplete. Given that the organization's response to complaints and grievances is so dependent on their board, its meeting schedule, and its public participation policies that we ultimately were unable to review, there are unanswered concerns about how this board will conduct itself in a transparent manner. In total, the applicant requested 19 waivers of various state laws applicable to public schools, including tenure laws, various employment laws, fiscal accountability standards that districts are expected to follow, school and district expectations from the state board, compensation laws, evaluation laws, in total 19. And the charter application rubric specifies that applicants are supposed to provide compelling evidence of how those waivers would improve student achievement if they were ultimately obtained. And we did not feel that the applicant provided that compelling evidence of improved student achievement if they were to obtain these waivers. While the review committee certainly appreciates the flexibility that charter schools are duly authorized to have under the law, without that compelling evidence of student performance, that we were unable to alleviate some of the initial concerns that we had. And in fact, the applicant was asked that question directly in the interview if they could provide some evidence of how their waivers that they requested would improve student achievement. And the indication was that a lot of those waivers were fairly common to other waivers that charter schools had gotten in the past, but we still didn't get that compelling evidence of improved student achievement that would result from those waivers. There were also inconsistencies between the organizational chart provided by the applicant and their startup plan, and some of their job descriptions that they provided. There were a few positions, specifically ahead of schools, as an example, that were highlighted in some parts of the application, but then weren't included in their organizational chart. Similarly, there were some concerns from the review committee members with items in their year zero budget that were not included, that were referenced in the startup plan, and that would need to be factored in their pre-opening year. That year zero budget is the pre-opening year for a charter school. So that entire year that they're operating, where they're preparing to enroll students and they're getting their buildings ready for students to come. Specifically, there weren't items included for their furniture, for student furniture, for equipment, for textbooks, for all of those items that you need to have at the ready for when students walk in the door. The applicant also indicates that they plan to limit technology use, and while the review committee certainly felt that approach is completely sufficient and understandable, the applicant did not include insight into how they will plan to maintain a network and how they'll plan to promote cybersecurity. Because despite their plan to limit technology, the applicant will still have to use technology for required state assessments. And so, given that focus on student data and how important of a role student data will play in that specific use of technology, the review committee felt that they needed a greater emphasis on how they would promote cybersecurity. And additionally, depending on how they plan to handle some of their payroll actions, some of their human resources actions, employee personnel files, things like that, that emphasis on cybersecurity needed to be more evident to ensure that student and employee data would be protected. The final section of a charter review application is the financial plan and capacity. And there aren't a lot of sections in this particular area. Charter applicants are expected to submit a proposed budget for their first 5 years of operation, including their startup year, year zero. And they're also expected to submit a budget narrative where they outline their assumptions for those expenses and things of that nature. Ultimately, the review committee felt that this applicant did not meet the standard for financial plan and capacity. The strength that we noted, especially from the interview, we were originally concerned upon initial review that the applicant indicated that most of their financing was going to come from a low interest or an interest-free loan. And when we reviewed the budget, there was no line item for how they planned to service that debt upon obtaining that loan. And they were able to communicate their access to additional sources of revenue over the course of the interview, which was an assurance for the review committee on that particular front. Ultimately, the review committee had a lack of assurance that the loan the applicant described would materialize in the way the applicant described. The loan is an interest-free loan or a low-interest loan, but the review committee did not feel that we had adequate assurance that that would be the case and that the applicant would not have to service that debt at some point, which is a major source of the revenue that they have for their school, that they would need to finance their operations. The applicant also, there were no cost assumptions included for the applicant's estimated expenses, which made that lack of assurance of the interest-free loan and the possibility for additional revenue even more concerning for the review committee, because we couldn't identify in the application how they built in some of the costs that they estimated for their year one budget. Similarly, we appreciated the applicant's desire to establish a conservative budget. That was something that the review committee definitely felt was a positive in many ways, that they attempted to outline a fiscally conservative budget for their years of operation. However, in comparing their operation costs with those of our similarly sized schools in our district, the review committee is fearful that they may have established an unrealistically conservative budget and that they may be faced with increases to costs. And to the fourth point, there was lacking evidence of contingency planning for possible increased costs, raw materials increases, things of that nature. And so the lack of assurance on the loan materializing in the way that it's specified, the lack of cost assumptions, the lack of contingency planning, all of those pieces encompassed together ultimately left the review committee feeling that this did not meet the standard. To summarize, for American Classical Academy Montgomery, Section 1, academic capacity, the applicant partially meets the standard. Section 2, the applicant does not meet the standard. And Section 3, the applicant does not meet the standard. I'll present the overall recommendation from the review committee in a few moments. I'd like to spend some time talking about our other applicant first, Austin Academy Charter High School, and share our summary ratings from that group. Austin Academy Charter High School, for its academic design and capacity, the review committee believed that this organization partially meets the standard. Several strengths from this applicant, particularly in this area. This applicant has been working to build community support for its school and for its model for about a year. They received a grant from the Tennessee Department of Education, a charter school expansion grant, last year in 2021. And with that grant, they've been working on being in the community, building relationships with the local Chamber of Commerce, with other local industries, to learn the needs of the community and build support for their model. Additionally, their model is one that could genuinely benefit students in the Clarksville-Montgomery County school system. And the review committee believes that there are many students in the school system that could gravitate to this kind of model. And ultimately, in the interview, the applicant showed a passion and a drive for working with at-risk students, which they identify as their focus and their mission. And that passion and that drive was evident in their interview. It was clear there was a passion there for the work that they want to do. Another area that was a strength for this applicant, those of our review committee members who were closely tied to the workforce in Montgomery County and to local businesses, indicated employers are looking for this model. It is something that employers would find very attractive. And finally, the applicant showed a spirit of partnership in their interview and in their application that review committee members greatly appreciated. Ultimately, the deficiencies in this particular portion of the application, first, the number of students that the applicant hopes to serve and the number of career services the applicant plans to offer do not align. In our experience staffing the virtual school, for instance, it takes several teachers to operate a high school specifically and offer the array of choices that the applicant wants to provide, because there are certain requirements for CTE certifications that are a little bit different than a standard teaching license. And so offering that level of choice can quickly add up in terms of how many teachers you need to have at a high school to offer that level of options. The applicant may need some kind of waiver in order to pursue the plans that they have to ensure that they would have more flexibility with that certification, those certification requirements. Another deficiency, there may be some flawed assumptions underlying whether their model can be successful in the school system. In the application, the applicant establishes their enrollment expectations based on a percentage of students at risk of dropping out by calculating that based on our graduation rate, 95%. They applied that 5% to our entire high school student body, which is not an accurate percentage. It's not an accurate way to establish those enrollment expectations. And also, the graduation rate established by the state does not include students who graduate with special education diplomas, students who ultimately get their GED. So it's not totally a reflection of the students in our district who ultimately end up without a high school diploma. For section 2, the review committee felt that this applicant did not meet the standard. Strengths in this portion of the application, the applicant indicated throughout their section a desire to be collaborative with the school district, with its policies, procedures, and other matters. So they expressed an interest in aligning themselves with our student code of conduct, with some of their employee practices and employment policies. And again, that spirit of partnership and that spirit of collaboration was recognized by the review committee and appreciated. They expressed an understanding of the real estate market that the review committee appreciated. As I indicated, they've been in the community for a year working to build support for their model. So they've had an opportunity to see just how quickly a property can get sold whenever you decide that you may want it. So one concern we had was a potential that maybe they weren't planning for that in their facilities plans, but it was clear that they experienced that and are more prepared for that. There was also some vagueness in their facilities planning portion of this section initially upon review. However, in their interview, the applicant was able to provide a thorough explanation as to why they were leaving some of their facilities plans somewhat vague. And ultimately, it related to their desire to really become immersed in the community, understand the needs of the students they would eventually serve, understand the needs of the families they would eventually serve, and let that dictate their concrete facilities plans. And the review committee appreciated that desire to work that closely with the community to determine a facility that may work for them, particularly since they hope to serve at-risk students. Some deficiencies in this particular portion of the application. The review committee ultimately is not assured that the applicant has the capital necessary to open and sustain a school, particularly from the facilities perspective. Again, as I indicated, they provided more insight on their plans for facilities during the interview that were appreciated by the review committee, and their desire to partner with the district and to partner with their families to learn more about their needs. They also provided more assurances that through their organization's leadership, they did have access to additional capital and additional revenue outside of a loan that they're currently expecting. However, the review committee ultimately noticed that with the organization's very conservative budget, particularly in facilities and renovations costs, with little contingency for any increased costs, that may not be enough to sustain them, and that was a concern. Second, there are some places in their application where they made omissions that were concerning